Hello, my name is Michael Gerrard. I'm a professor at Columbia Law School where I teach courses on environmental law and energy law. And I founded and direct the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law and am a member and former chair of the faculty of Columbia University's Earth Institute. I'm going to be speaking with you today about extreme heat events and associated wildfires and their impacts, their legal implications, and I'll close with some thoughts on how all of this should be reflected in environmental impact assessment. So I'm going to start by going back 20,000 years. This shows global average temperatures, smoothed out and averaged against over a long period of time. And the area in blue, which goes back about 10,000 years, is the Holocene period. Human civilization arose during the Holocene period. We're still in it. And it is during this period, you can see that global temperatures varied within a fairly narrow band. So our cities were formed on coastlines as they existed within that narrow band, our agricultural patterns, our water supply patterns. We are now outside that band. And the question is, how much further are we going to go? This chart merely goes back to 1880 and shows global average temperatures since then. And the trend is unmistakable. There are annual fluctuations back and forth, but the trend is unmistakable. Five of the warmest years in recorded history are the past 5 years. And 2020 is currently on track to be either the warmest or the second warmest year in recorded history. This shows that we're already at about 1 degree centigrade above pre-industrial conditions we were before the last 5 years. We've now gone past that. If these trends continue, if the slope of the line continues at the current rate, actually, maybe it's gone up, but let's just assume it has continued. This is what we're looking at, and we will blow past 2 degrees by about 2060 or so, and past 1.5 degrees by maybe 2028. One of the things that is happening as a result of some of this is temperatures are obviously it gets warmer. You have higher temperatures, including heat waves, and so the National Weather Service has put out this chart, which shows on the horizontal axis is temperature in Fahrenheit, vertical axis is relative humidity. And and these charts did not go above 110 degrees Fahrenheit because we didn't expect to see temperatures above 110 degrees Fahrenheit. But now we have. In August of 2020, the appropriately named Death Valley, California, had a temperature of 130, which may have been the highest recorded temperature on the surface on the land surface of the U.S. But we had very high temperatures above the 110 degrees that was the limit of the chart. And then in California, on September 6th, we saw several cities in California that were well above 110. And so the National Weather Service has had to come up with new charts that go up to 130. And you can see that at 130 degrees, even a relative humidity of just 10% is classified as extremely dangerous. And there's a footnote in the National Weather Service chart. Since heat index values were devised for shady, light wind conditions, exposure to full sunshine can increase index valued by up to 15 degrees. And so clearly outdoor working or recreation is impossible under those circumstances. And what we're now seeing, more studies are finding that the Earth, including some populated regions of the Earth, will experience temperature and humidity combinations that are too severe for human tolerance. That some studies have shown that after about 5 or 6 hours of exposure to this kind of temperature humidity combination, people can't survive. They have to be in air conditioning. So this chart shows the average number of extremely hot days expected per year between 2020 and 2039. This is not the end of the century. This is right now under a moderate warming scenario. This is not the worst case for greenhouse gas emissions and warming. It's a moderate scenario, and we see parts of the world, Australia, parts of India and Pakistan, Central Africa, that where the days per year above 95 degrees Fahrenheit is more than 200. So that almost every day, that most days, you're above 95 degrees. Now, one of the things that is worsened by extreme heat is wildfires. Here we have Australia, parts of extreme heat in Australia, and we had these extreme wildfires in Australia. And now, as I make this recording, we're having that in California and in Oregon. A number of scientific studies have shown a real relationship between climate change and wildfire risk, particularly if you have a rainy season that leads to a lot of vegetation, and then you have drought and heat that cause that vegetation to dry up and become kindling. If there's a spark, you can have a conflagration, and that's what's happening now. The Los Angeles Times had this stark front page: California's climate apocalypse, fires, heat, air pollution. The calamity is no longer in the future, it's here now. And the impacts of these wildfires are not only local. They cause smoke to spread over a very wide area. So September 15th, 2020, we see high levels of smoke that has all across Canada and the United States, as far as the St. John's, Newfoundland. The website IQ Air, reports on air quality monitoring, and on September 16th, 2020, of all the cities in the world, it ranked Portland, Oregon, as having the worst air quality, followed shortly behind by Vancouver, British Columbia, and below that is Delhi. Now, Delhi has notoriously poor air quality, but Portland and Vancouver on this day had worse, and Seattle was right below that, followed by Lahore, Pakistan. The levels of PM 2.5 are remarkable. So in Portland, Oregon, on September 15th, you had PM 2.5 levels of in the 400s, whereas we know that PM 2.5 of just 100 can lead to lots of negative health impacts. So, as I said, we're now a little bit over 1 degree centigrade on a global average basis. The general view for quite a few years has been that the temperature target we should seek is 2 degrees Celsius, or 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's what was agreed to at the Copenhagen Conference in 2009 of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. In Paris in 2015, the agreement was well below 2 degrees, but try to keep as close to 1.5 degrees as possible. But in Paris, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was asked to do a report comparing 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, because the small island nations were saying 2 degrees isn't good enough. At 2 degrees, we're underwater. We want to see what 1.5 degrees is. So the IPCC came out with its report in late 2008 showing that terrible, terrible things happen at 2 degrees, and we should try to keep to 1.5 degrees if we possibly can. Now, we are today at 1 degree, and we're seeing terrible things happen. But in terms of where the world is headed, this chart is looking at global greenhouse gas emissions under different scenarios out to 2050. So here we see what the actual trends have been. Here are some policies that are on the books but not necessarily being implemented. Here are the Paris pledges. If all the Paris pledges are added up, this would take us to a world that is a little over 3 degrees. There are also some conditional Paris pledges by some developing countries of what they would do if it's financed by the developed countries. That would take us here. This is where we would need to be at 2 degrees, and this is where we would need to be at 1.5 degrees. Another depiction of the same idea is a scenario for business as usual emissions and a bunch of different scenarios for 1.5 degrees. And what this shows is that by around 2060, we would need to be at net zero emissions, and then we would need to be going into net negative emissions. In other words, we would need to be withdrawing from the atmosphere more greenhouse gases than we are putting into the atmosphere. Very few people expect this to happen. The reality is likely to be somewhere in between 1.5 and the business as usual, which is 3.5 degrees, something like that. But for purposes of this presentation, it's clear it's going to get a lot hotter. Under any plausible scenario, the world is going to get a lot hotter than it is today. These are some projections for the United States under different scenarios. And this is observed mid-21st century, late 21st century, with lower emission and higher emission scenarios. On a global basis, it looks like this. At the end of the century, under high emissions, 4.8 degrees, we're here. At 2.7 degrees, we're here, and so forth. And this is just average temperatures. What's really the most dangerous is the extremes. So when the averages shift, so do the extremes. Here for summer temperatures in North America, 1951 to 1980, and 2005 to 2015. The extremes have already been shifting to the right, to the warmer end. Now, the good news is fewer people are freezing to death, which is a good thing, but you have much more heat. And this heat is the most lethal impact of climate change, at least so far. The U.S. Global Change Research Program said to expect an increase of thousands to tens of thousands of premature heat-related deaths in the summer each year as a result of climate change by the end of the century, each year. So, as I say, heat is the most lethal impact of climate change. here from the U.S. National Weather Service, weather fatalities, and look at the yellow are the 30-year averages. So here is heat, and number two is flooding. The blue are 10-year averages, so 10-year heat, tornadoes, floods. And there have been some famous episodes where we've seen large numbers of deaths. Europe in 2003 saw an extensive heat wave which led to a very large number of deaths, and it was closely correlated to the temperatures. That after a few days of extreme heat, as shown here, the death rate spiked. Chicago had a similar kind of heat wave, and a similar kind in 1995, and you had a similar pattern that deaths peaked after several days of this extreme heat. The elderly are the most vulnerable to this kind of issue. It's been established that there's an association between the temperatures and heat-related emergency room visits. And so heat waves can have a variety of impacts. Mortality, I just mentioned about heat stroke, heat injury, heat exhaustion, submortality, but still very unhealthy. Heat also causes higher production of ground-level ozone, which has its own adverse health impacts. I just talked about wildfires. Reduced economic productivity. You can't work outdoors. Even a lot of indoor work, if you don't have air conditioning, is impeded. Extreme heat leads to higher electricity demand because everybody has their air conditioning on full blast, but also lower supply. The ability of electrical cables to carry heat depends on their ability to carry electricity, is limited by their ability to dissipate heat. And if the air around them is already hot, the cables can dissipate less heat and carry less power. High heat also impedes the cooling systems of steam electric power plants, because if the water coming in from the stream or the lake or the ocean is too warm, it can't cool the power plant effectively. And so a number of power plants have had to temporarily shut down because their cooling systems wouldn't work. The extreme heat can damage infrastructure like asphalt, pavement, and in some instances, particularly at higher altitudes, we've seen that it's restricted airplane movements. There's not enough air density for the airplanes to take off. We have seen that all this is made worse. The health impacts of extreme heat are made worse for people with COVID. That in the midst of the pandemic, the adverse health effects of getting the virus are worsened during extreme heat. And so the World Meteorological Organization of the United Nations has come out with guidance on trying to manage the health risks of extreme heat during this pandemic. Now, for those people who don't have air conditioning, one thing that many cities have established are cooling centers where people can go and sit in an air-conditioned room for a while. But of course, this doesn't work well in a pandemic either, because social distancing is not easy to maintain under these kinds of conditions. The legal protections for this sort of thing are very limited, and that's what I want to turn to now. In 1986, the U.S. National Institute of Occupational Health and Safety issued proposed guidelines on occupational exposure in hot environments, but these have not become binding. The U.S. federal government hasn't done that. NIOSH, this organization, is just advisory. It gives advice to OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, but OSHA has not adopted binding guidelines for this kind of heat. The state of California, and so the U.S. Department of Labor, OSHA, has guidelines, but again, they're just advisory. They're not binding or enforceable. California has adopted binding requirements for outdoor heat for people who have to work outside. We also see disparities based on race in heat-related mortality. Obviously, there's a correlation between race and economic status. People lower economic status are less likely to have air conditioning, and so there's a real correlation between having air conditioning and income level and race and mortality. All these things are related. A number of states have cooling programs where they will provide money to some low-income households to buy air conditioners, but they don't provide for funding to run the air conditioners. And so the electricity costs can be very high and can be out of reach by many low-income households, and they do not receive governmental assistance to help them with that. The percentage of households in the U.S. with air conditioning has certainly increased very considerably. So about 85% of the homes in the U.S. had air conditioning in 2015. Obviously, it's distributed geographically, but we see parts of the country that never used to or almost never had heat waves, and therefore few people had air conditioning. But now they are experiencing heat waves, and people still don't have air conditioning, and those without air conditioning are typically the poorer people. And so the Pacific Northwest had, traditionally was cool, didn't have very air conditioning, but that's a real problem. This is, obviously even a worse problem in some other perennial hotter parts of the world. This is a scene from India. And one of the impacts that this has, of course, is considerably increasing the amount of energy consumed by air conditioning. As the world gets warmer, more people are going to need air conditioning, and that will tremendously increase the electrical load in almost every part of the world. This will also lead to an increase in the emissions of hydrofluorocarbons, which are a powerful greenhouse gas. Now, there are technological approaches to all of these things. There are ways to have much more efficient air conditioners that consume less electricity. There are ways to make air conditioners so that they don't release HFCs in the same amount. That was a major issue in the Kigali Agreement of 2016, aimed at reducing HFC releases into the atmosphere, because those are a major contributor to climate change because of the high global warming potential of HFCs. Different countries had different obligations. India was among the countries that was able to get more of an extension in achieving the requirements here for reducing their HFCs. Now, hot conditions have existed in parts of the world for a very long time, and we have long had building design and construction techniques that were designed to keep out sunlight, to maximize airflow, to use the screening from trees and so forth in order to reduce the the heat inside buildings. And going back even longer, there are some traditional kinds of structures in hot areas that have been dealing with heat. So this is a hotel in Tunisia that actually is just sort of a reconstruction of something that had been there for many, many years. That was designed to help deal with the outdoor heat, and this was the filming location for a scene in a very famous movie. So this is Luke Skywalker with the unfortunate Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru, filmed inside this this location in Tunisia, which was built to withstand heat. In other parts of the world, we have had traditional methods. This is in New York City and Manhattan, the Flatiron Building, which is around 23rd Street. This is a picture from early in the 20th century, and we see that it had shades on the windows, and these shades blocked out the heat. Once air conditioning was, became common, the shades came off. It makes sense now to put the shades back on. New York City revised its building codes a couple of years ago to allow that kind of thing again, but you still don't have shades on the Flatiron Building. You very, very rarely see this kind of shading anymore in big city buildings, but shading is very effective in keeping out the sun, as people have known for hundreds or thousands of years. So there are a number of legal tools that one could imagine that could be used to reduce the exposure to extreme heat. Few of them are, in fact, in use, but it could be done. In almost every state in the U.S. and in some other parts of the world, there is something called a warranty of habitability. It is basically something implicit or explicit in residential leases, saying that the place is habitable. You can live there, and so they have traditionally included heat in the winter. They could also include cooling in hot conditions. There are a few cities in the United States, led by Phoenix, Arizona, that have built this into the law, but it could be extended more broadly than that. I mentioned the low-income energy assistance programs that in some states pay for the purchase of air conditioners. Those could be expanded to cover the electricity bills for the air conditioners. A lot of public housing does not have air conditioning. That could be required. Building codes could be revised to require shading and other methods to help protect against heat. The most efficient air conditioners could be required as a way of reducing their energy load, and and other methods could be required to reduce the HFC production. Now, of course, a dilemma in all of this is that it all costs money, and who's going to pay for that? So it has could have a real impact on the affordability of housing unless there is some kind of government subsidy for it. And this is an issue that has not been resolved, and that now is not an era, obviously, if there ever was one, when governments felt flush and able to provide these kinds of subsidies. There are a few legal protections for vulnerable populations. A federal statute in the U.S., the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, says that school districts must make reasonable accommodations for disabled students. and the disabled students each are supposed to get an individual education program suited to their disability, and some of those programs cover air conditioning. As a result of that, some cities, including New York, are requiring air conditioning on school buses that will carry disabled students. But there are no OSHA standards for outdoor workers. That ought to be adopted. Social service programs should check in on elderly and disabled people, especially living alone. Some prior studies, especially in Paris and Chicago, have shown that the highest death rate was among elderly or disabled people living alone who nobody checked in on, and they died in their apartments. One population that does receive, at least in theory, some legal protections from heat, ironically enough, is prisoners. Our center at Columbia did a study a few years ago on the issue of heat in U.S. prisons and jails, showed that most prisons and jails are not air conditioned, and this can lead to hazardous conditions. Obviously, unlike most other places, the residents of prisons and jails have no mobility. They have no ability to go anywhere else. A number of court decisions have found that this extreme heat in prisons is a violation of the requirement in the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution against cruel and unusual punishment. And so there are a number of court orders affecting certain prisons in the U.S. that require some cooling to be provided. Now, I've mostly been talking about buildings, but on a somewhat larger scale, on the city level, we have the urban heat island effect, that it is hotter in the middle of the city than it is outside the city, because you have all this pavement and buildings that absorb heat, and the buildings themselves generate heat because the air conditioning works by moving the heat from inside to outside. And you have all these motor vehicles that are emitting heat. So it is hotter in cities than it is outside cities, and some parts of cities are hotter than others. You can have variations on a block by block basis. And one of the major factors there is trees. Do you have trees that provide shading? And so one of the major efforts to cool cities is plant a lot more trees. Now, the trees don't generate all that much oxygen. That's a good thing they do, but they do provide a lot of shading, and they've been shown to have a marked effect on cooling down cities. New York City adopted what they called the Million Trees program, where they made a million trees available to people to plant along the street. And it was so successful, they then extended it to a lot more trees. We're seeing in some buildings designs that have green roofs or other green features that also provide cooling and also help absorb excess storm flows. This is a pair of apartment towers in Milan, Italy, with vegetation on all the balconies. Here in New York City, now this was really put there more for aesthetic purposes, and I can only imagine that the maintenance costs are fairly high. But we may see more vegetation not only on the street level but also at the in buildings. One way to achieve cooling that is a lot less expensive is just white roofs. Now, this picture shows Al Gore and Michael Bloomberg, not in their usual garb, but at a ceremony in which they are painting a roof white. And so just painting roofs white, which is a very inexpensive thing to do, really has a marked impact on cooling the building, on reducing the air conditioning load inside the building. And so even for those places that can't afford the more elaborate green roofs, painting buildings white makes a lot of sense. And there are some cities that in their building codes are requiring that the roofs of buildings, if the layout of the roof is at all suitable to this, either have white roofs or green roofs or solar panels. All three are environmentally positive things to do, and there's a lot of roof space out there. And so that at least new roofs and in a few laws, renovations of existing roofs have to have at least one of these features. There's also the possibility for building this into some infrastructure. So there have been experiments with putting with light-colored paving materials, and these light-colored paving materials also have the effect of, they reflect more of the heat rather than absorbing it, and have a positive impact. This is a parking lot where you see the roofs have solar panels, and this provides shading for the cars underneath. And so when it's hot out, the cars don't bake inside, and you get the solar energy from the panels. A few cities in China have developed a few systems with misting. This is at a bus stop. And so in hot conditions, they mist out water to the people who are waiting there at the bus stop. And we may see more of this as the heat conditions get worse, more places that have to do this as a way of cooling the outdoors. In the Persian Gulf, there are a few places where they've actually started putting air conditioning in some outdoor locations, which sounds crazy, and you can only imagine the energy costs of doing that. But if you're in a place where the outdoor conditions are just unendurable, people will take measures to try to do what they can if they have the money to do that. So, as I've discussed, there are a number of techniques that could be used to reduce the urban heat island effect. I've talked about white roofs, green roofs, more vegetation and trees, landscaping requirements for developments, and light-colored pavement. Another thing that is necessary is to have contingency plans for when there is extreme heat. So the California's Office of Emergency Services has developed a contingency plan for extreme heat emergencies. One of the most advanced plans, interestingly enough, is in a city in India that has developed a very elaborate heat emergency plan, in which they have developed a system where if the temperature forecast is expecting extreme heat, an alert is issued, and there's a central office that notifies lots of different entities to take certain pre-planned contingency actions. I mentioned cooling centers. Some cities have cooling centers now. COVID obviously makes that much more complicated. We've seen In some places where there are very large recreational pools, lots of people retreating to these pools in times of extreme heat. This is a scene out of a large pool in China, where you had thousands of people just jumping in the water, many of them with little pool toys, I guess, to help them keep distance. Again, one can't imagine how this works during a pandemic. One also can't imagine how this works for any period of time. One effect of heat waves is that often it stays hot at night as well as during the day. Now, if people want to stay in this pool overnight, you can just imagine the sanitation problems, the problems of sexual assault, the problems that some people will want to take their dogs and cats into the pools with them so the dogs and cats don't bake in the heat. It's just unimaginable situation. But one can begin to imagine this with these projections of heat in areas where not everybody can afford to have air conditioning. So we have various emergency response measures that have been adopted and proposed to cover a variety of these conditions. Phoenix, Arizona, as I mentioned, is in the forefront. It's a very hot, affluent city. So in addition to the cooling ordinance for rental units that I mentioned that requires rental units to have cooling, they have a tree and shade master plan. They have a lot of cooling stations. They have hydration stations where people can get water and give out free water bottles. They have public education. They put out various kind of guidelines for how people can stay cool in the summer. So all of this has impacts for impact assessment. We have not yet seen a lot of guidelines or legal requirements that are explicitly aimed at this, but my argument today is that the projections are such that we need to do that extreme heat is going to become such an important feature of the environment in the locations of so many projects that the time has come to be explicitly talking about heat in impact assessment. So that should include discussion of temperature projections and scenarios under different greenhouse gas emission standpoints, and these kinds of projections and scenarios are readily available on a regional basis. They are not as readily available on a site-specific basis, but the techniques exist to do that. In a minute, I'll show you an example where that was done. There should also be discussion of wildfire projections and scenarios as one thinks about potential scenarios for whether it's called worst case analysis or just scenarios. One of them includes wildfires. We've seen the situations in some place where you have a wildfire that consumes a chemical storage facility or chemical manufacturing plant, and you can imagine that obviously leads to very severe impacts. There have been some explosions, some releases of toxic gases into the atmosphere. So that's in certain areas of the world, that's a very plausible thing to happen. You can project what happens with the supply and demand for electricity. That could be included in an impact statement. Impact statements could discuss alternative building designs that would be designed to withstand extreme heat and have and increase the safety of the occupants of the buildings, whether it's residential or commercial or whatever. One could, I think, should include the alternative when the site is appropriate for that kind of thing, tree planting as a mitigation measure to reduce some of these impacts, and urban planning design alternatives, and thinking about an urban plan and streetscapes and so forth, designing them to have to reduce these kinds of impacts. If we're talking about a project or an activity or an action that would involve outdoor activities, whether it's a recreational facility, a golf course, or whatever it is where people are supposed to be outside, or construction has to be done outdoors, or agricultural operations, the effect of heat and the ability to do all of that should be analyzed. If you're designing a golf course, it may be that it actually can be used only a fraction of the year because in significant parts of the year, it's going to be too hot for outdoor play. Or if you're designing a project that would require a lot of outdoor construction and the time period during which outdoor construction work can happen is so limited because of the constraints of heat, that ought to be disclosed. And of course, this heat has an impact not only on humans, but on non-human species. And so analyses of current habitat conditions ought to include heat. So as I said, one example where this has been done is in New York. The New York Public Service Commission required Con Edison, the major electric utility in New York City, to conduct a climate change vulnerability study. Con Ed agreed to this. It resulted from a proceeding that the group I had, the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia, helped launch. But Con Ed did this study, which took a look at did geographically fine-tuned studies about future projections of conditions within the Con Ed service territory, parts of the New York City metropolitan area, where they did projections about future temperature conditions under different greenhouse gas scenarios, as well as future extreme precipitation and flooding and storm surge. And with these geographically fine-grained projections, came out with implementation recommendations for how the New York City electrical system can better withstand these anticipated extreme weather events worsened by climate change. So right now, Con Ed is preparing the implementation plan to carry out these results. This kind of study, in my view, should be done much more broadly for many different kinds of operations. We know that the climate is going to get worse. We're a little bit above 1 degree centigrade. We're going to move up. We will probably, under almost all scenarios, exceed 2 degrees in a few decades. This is going to have very significant impacts on projects that are being built today that have a life expectancy going into the latter part of the century, at least. The future conditions and analysis in impact assessments should look not only at current conditions, but also at conditions throughout the expected lifetime of the project under study. We now know that the expected lifetime of projects that are under study today for many of these projects will include conditions of extreme heat and precipitation, and depending on the location, flooding and storm surge. And I think that it is high time to be fully considering those issues in impact statements on a global basis. Thank you very much.